In the early days of carrier aviation, no one was quite sure what to do. There was a persistent belief, for example, that cruisers could get into gunfights with aircraft carriers. It's for this reason that you see the 8-inch guns on USS Lexington, or the similar provisions on Akagi and Kaga. For the most part, these guns never saw use. Aircraft carriers getting into a gunfight was incredibly rare, and not one of the ships with the big 8-inch guns actually did so. But other carriers did, and that's the topic of today's video. This will look at 3 examples from the Royal Navy and United States Navy, a fleet carrier, and 2 smaller vessels. These are probably the most well-known examples of this happening, but they're still worth covering. Let's get into it now, starting with the Royal Navy and a fleet carrier lumbering into a surface action. That ship was HMS Formidable, and her famous action came at the Battle of Cape Matapan. This was the worst defeat for the Italian Navy, and Formidable is largely responsible. On March 28, 1941, one of her aircraft spotted the Italian fleet. This had set sail to try and interdict convoy traffic, but the Royal Navy had broken their code, and knew the fleet was at sea, even if not exactly where. Formidable's scout gave them the final information they needed. As such, an air attack was launched. Aircraft were sent out to stop, or at least slow down the Italian formation, so the slower British battleships could catch up. In this, the carrier's pilots would be mostly successful. They couldn't stop the battleship Vittorio Veneto. The British pilots did a number on her stern, but not enough to stop the ship. The cruiser Pola, on the other hand, was crippled outright, left adrift without main power after Formidable's pilots put a torpedo in her side. It was this strike that led to the crushing Italian defeat. Pola's sister ships, Zara and Fiume, were sent back with destroyer escort. They were assigned to assist Pola, but this only left them vulnerable in the gathering darkness. British radar had spotted the Italian ships, which allowed their battleships to sneak up on the unsuspecting cruisers, where Warspite, Valiant, and Barham proceeded to blast the Italians to pieces. However, Formidable was in the main battle line with the battleships during at least part of this process, specifically third in the line behind Warspite and Valiant. This has resulted in a story cropping up that Formidable opened fire alongside the battleships and managed to land a hit with her 4.5-inch guns. As the story goes, Formidable sailed right along with the battleships. When the order to open fire went out, her crew decided that meant the carrier as well. So the secondary battery, mounted high in the ship, fired at least 1 salvo. This seemingly surprised everyone else involved, and the carrier was hastily ordered to back away. While it was apparent the Italians weren't a real threat, no one wanted a repeat of what happened to Glorious. So, after firing her guns, Formidable broke from the battleships and sailed off into the darkness. One of the few times an aircraft carrier used her guns on a surface target. But did this actually happen? Well, it's been reported enough that I chose to cover it. However, sources do differ. It's referenced in Ian Ballantyne's book on HMS Warspite. There's also an online source with a quote attributed to Admiral Cunningham. To quote, "The Formidable also had an escape. When action was joined, she hauled out to starboard at full speed, a night battle being no place for a carrier." This is, on the other hand, not referenced in Hobbs' book on British carriers, or, for that matter, O'Hara's Struggle for the Middle Sea. Both of those are good sources that I'd expect to include something like this. That they don't is telling, especially with how notable British carrier gets in night battle with Italian cruisers is as a story. It doesn't rule it out, mind you, but it does make me a bit curious how true this actually is. So naturally, take this with a grain of salt. If anyone has other references to this happening, by all means put it in the comments. I'd love to read them. That does round off Formidable, so now we can look at the second story. Sticking with the Royal Navy, but leaving the Mediterranean behind, for, of all things, the Korean War, and of all ships, the maintenance carrier that moonlighted as a light carrier, that being HMS Unicorn. In her case, this would not involve getting in a gunfight with enemy warships, which shouldn't really be surprising because the Korean War is not exactly known for naval combat. Neither North Korea or China had much in the way of a navy, and what the Chinese did have was kept very far away. Probably a good thing, considering the forces off Korea. Regardless, with no naval targets to speak of, carriers were relegated to ground support. This usually meant launching aircraft strikes, as you'd expect. Unicorn's captain and crew, however, decided no, that's not enough, and took their ship in closer to shore. Ground attack aircraft weren't enough, oh no, Unicorn had to use her guns instead. As such, the ship moved much closer to shore than an aircraft carrier should really get. Unicorn then opened fire on North Korean coastwatcher positions on September 22, 1951. The carrier fired up to 16 salvos, with at least 3 hitting their mark. Considering this was using 4-inch guns that weren't even slightly intended for shore bombardment, this is impressive. It's also the one and only time that I'm aware of where an aircraft carrier performed shore bombardment duties. Admittedly, it wasn't going to shoot up a contested beach. This was light duty as far as shore targets go. Coastwatchers were an important target, don't get me wrong. They would report naval movements to troops inland, which could cause real issues later on, especially if air attacks were directed based off their intelligence. Still, if Unicorn had to be shooting things up with her secondary battery, this was probably a fitting target, since the North Koreans couldn't shoot back. Nonetheless, Unicorn was not designed for this, or trained for it. I would love to be a fly on the wall during the discussion leading up to this. Just imagine how wacky it must have been to be ordered in on shore bombardment in a light maintenance carrier. I also imagine there were some serious discussions when Unicorn's captain reported the incident. Also, incidentally, this story is reported by Hobbs, and has been reposted online by the U.S. Naval Institute. So while the details might change in the telling, I'm pretty certain this one actually happened. Either way, that finishes off this story, which leaves one remaining incident for this video. What is probably the best known of the bunch, even though the details have since been proven wrong. USS White Plains and her gunnery duel with the heavy cruiser Chokai. This came during the battle off Samar, which has, of course, been covered in great detail in a number of formats. For the purpose of this video, I'll focus on White Plains and her gunnery duel. The story goes this way. As the Taffy 3 carriers retreated from the Japanese center force, White Plains blasted away with her single 5-inch gun. This was mounted on the stern, which allowed for its use in this case. That the gun crew fired away, and that they targeted a Japanese heavy cruiser, is certainly true. This can be pretty easily confirmed. On the other hand, the details are a different story. The gun crew claimed 6 hits, specifically on Chokai. For the longest time, this was accepted as fact, as was the fact that one of those hits was particularly devastating. This shell hit supposedly blew up Chokai's long lance torpedoes. Those were notoriously finicky and could certainly be detonated by fire or combat damage. Mogami, as an example, had fires detonate some of her torpedoes as she retreated from Surigao Strait. The same goes for Mikuma at the Battle of Midway. So it wasn't unbelievable that White Plains landed this hit. It was not, however, supported by Japanese sources. Those claim the crippling damage came from air attack and not from the torpedoes blowing up. Nonetheless, the story endured for decades, even repeated in Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. It was difficult to disprove it until the wreck could be located. When Chokai's wreck was discovered in 2019, the Petrol team put special attention into her torpedo tubes to confirm or deny White Plains' supposed hit. As it turned out, all 4 sets of tubes were intact. There was no sign of any massive explosions on this wreck, which served to confirm that Chokai was not crippled by her own torpedoes. This shouldn't take away from the heroism of White Plains gunners, and they still could have landed hits on Chokai. But the often repeated story of the torpedoes blowing up, that didn't actually happen. And with that, we come to the end of this video. Formidable and Unicorn were success stories, assuming they both happened as the stories are told, and White Plains was, too, in regard to the carrier surviving. That she didn't actually cripple Chokai doesn't take that away from her in the end. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.